We've all heard about the heartbreaking tale of slavery, the dark era of the transatlantic slave trade, the terrible hardships forced upon men, women, and children, and how eventually, thank goodness, the slave trade was abolished. But here's something not many folks are aware of: the abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century actually gave rise to a whole new and even more sinister form of slavery: sex farms and slave breeding. Farms. Let me break down what went on in those farms back in the day. Their main goal was simple: to produce more slaves. See, slave owners couldn't import slaves from Africa anymore, so they resorted to breeding them like animals. It's awful, I know. They'd carefully choose which slaves would mate based on their physical attributes, health, and even intelligence, all to get the strongest and most profitable offspring. Can you believe it? These slave breeding farms were spread throughout the sub-southern United States, with maybe as many as 70 running at their peak. Wealthy plantation owners saw this as a money-making opportunity, and that's just terrible. But wait, there's more. Some owners even set up sex farms where young girls were forced into sexual activity with other slaves, or even the owners themselves. The offspring from these awful encounters were also seen as commodities and sold off at auctions. It's hard to grasp the full yenti of these practices, since records were destroyed or hidden, but thousands of slaves were forced to participate in these breeding programs, resulting in countless atrocities and human rights violations unimaginably horrible. Right before we begin, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more history secrets. While these facts may be unsettling, it's crucial to confront the harsh reality and inhumane nature of slavery in all its manifestations before deciding to subscribe to this channel for more similar content. Enslaved women as breeding machines. During slavery, it's heartbreaking to think about how enslaved women were treated like mere breeding machines. Plantation owners and overseers saw them as nothing more than a way to produce more enslaved people to boost their own wealth and power. It's awful, but they were forced to have sex with several men against their will, with no regard for their own desires or consent. This terrible practice was especially common in the Deep South, where cotton cultivation demanded a lot of enslaved labor. The women endured brutal physical and sexual abuse, and they had no way to escape or seek justice. It's devastating to think they were seen as property, not as human beings. And what's even more disheartening is that forced breeding wasn't limited to the Deep South. It happened in other regions too. Enslaved women in the Chesapeake Bay area and the Upper South suffered the same fate as plantation owners. They also sought to increase their wealth and power through these horrifying means. The evidence of this forced breeding can be found in various historical sources, and it serves as a grim reminder of the terrible atrocities they endured. When we look at plantation records, they often mention enslaved women who were used as breeders or breeding stock. These records go further to give details about the number of children these women had, their age, health, and other relevant information. And it's not just plantation records. There are also countless slave narratives that tell the stories of these women who were forced to bear children. One of these powerful narratives is from Harriet Jacobs, an enslaved woman living in North Carolina during the mid-19th century. In her memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she bravely shares the horrors of being forced to have sexual relations with her owner for the sole purpose of producing children. Sexual exploitation of female slaves. During the time of American slavery, it was just awful what happened to female slaves. They were forced into sexual relationships with their owners or overseers, and sexual abuse was rampant. It wasn't limited to one region or plantation. It was all over the American South. Even during the transatlantic slave trade, slave women endured terrible conditions and were subjected to sexual abuse by crew members and other male slaves. Once they reached the American South, things got even worse. They faced rape, forced relationships, and prostitution at the hands of their owners and overseers, who took advantage of their power. Many of these relationships were violent and non-consensual, resulting in pregnancies. The children born from these situations were considered the property of their mother's owners, which meant they were also slaves and could be bought or sold like commodities. Separation of families on sex farms. The offspring produced on sex farms were sadly separated from their families right after they were weaned. It was such a widespread practice to separate families during those times, and it was especially common on sex farms. Enslaved women were forced to breed and often got impregnated by men who weren't their husbands or partners. The children born on these farms weren't considered part of a family unit, but rather a commodity to be sold for profit. Plantation owners saw selling enslaved children as a profitable business opportunity, and they were usually sold at higher prices compared to adults, as they could grow up to be productive laborers and future breeders themselves. Imagine those traumatic public auctions where families were torn apart, causing emotional pain for everyone involved. Historian Edward E. Baptist described how families wailed and moaned, sobbed and screamed, reaching for their loved ones being sold away. The long-lasting effects of these separations were immense, with children facing a lifetime of trauma and loss and parents burdened with the pain of giving up their children. Rewarding enslaved men for forced breeding. Some plantation owners actually offered rewards to enslaved men Who could impregnate the most women? It's hard to believe, right? But that was the reality on some sex farms. These owners would give incentives to enslaved men who could produce the most offspring, all for the sake of making a profit from selling them. Can you imagine the dehumanization and lack of agency these enslaved people faced? They were treated like mere property, not human beings with their own rights. To make it even worse, some owners would set up competitions between enslaved men to see who could impregnate the most women. This toxic environment caused harm not only to the women forced to participate but also to the men, as they had to compete for their enslavers' approval. One chilling example is James Hammond, a plantation owner in South Carolina, who proudly wrote in his diary about breeding enslaved people for profit and offering rewards to the men who could impregnate the most women. The consequences of this behavior were devastating, with families torn apart as the offspring were sold as soon as they were weaned. It's not just morally reprehensible but had lasting impacts on the lives of those enslaved people. Differential treatment of good breeders. Some of women, those who were considered good breeders, were treated slightly better than the others. When the slave trade was abolished, these slave owners turned to women to increase their slave population. It's crazy to think that they saw women as nothing but baby-making machines. They judged them based on age, looks, and how fertile they were, to decide their worth. The ones who met the criteria were forced to have sex with male slaves against their will and were closely monitored during their pregnancies. And you won't believe this, but those women got better living conditions, better food, and were treated nicer than the others because their babies were more valuable to the owners. One famous abolitionist, Harriet Jacobs, went through this ordeal too. She had to have children with her owner and she was treated relatively better because she was deemed a good breeder, but she stood up for herself, refused to have more kids, and hid for years to avoid him. Still, even with this preferential treatment, enslaved women had to endure brutal conditions and were treated as mere property, forced to have sex without their consent. Slave breeding as a lucrative business. Slave breeding back then was a super profitable business for those slave owners. It was all about increasing their wealth. They figured, why pay for additional labor when they could produce more enslaved people right on their plantations? So they kept detailed records of the kids born there, noting their age, sex, and who their parents were. Those records helped them keep track of their assets and calculate the value of their property like some kind of horrible business. It breaks my heart to think that children born to enslaved mothers were often sold at auctions and the price was determined by factors like age, health, and sex. It's just sickening. Take Thomas Thistlewood, for instance, a Jamaican plantation owner who had these meticulous records of his breeding practices. He recorded over 3,000 births between 1750 and 1786, and many of these children were the product of forced breeding. Can you imagine? He saw it as a way to make more money, even writing in his diary that breeding women were more profitable than men. Another example is Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, two slave traders from Alexandria, Virginia. They made a fortune buying and selling slaves, and they also engaged in the cruel practice of slave breeding. Franklin is believed to have fathered over 600 children with female slaves he possessed, and these poor kids were then sold or traded for profit. It's just beyond cruel. There are plenty of historical documents that show the barbaric reality of slave breeding, like those advertisements for slave auctions where they shamelessly highlighted the breeding capabilities of enslaved women. They called them prolific breeders or good breeders. Can you believe it? It's just inhumane and exploitative, and it's important not to forget the dark chapter of our history. Doctors overseeing the inhumane breeding during the antebellum period. Plantation owners had this practice of hiring doctors to oversee the breeding of enslaved people and take care of their medical needs. It might sound strange. I mean, doctors are supposed to be healers, right? But that's just how things were. These doctors made sure that the enslaved women were healthy enough to have children and treated any medical issues that came up during the breeding process. One doctor, Dr. J. Marin Sims, is quite notorious for his experimental surgeries on enslaved women. He even performed surgeries without anesthesia because he believed they didn't feel pain like white people did. His work led to some new surgical techniques, but it came at a terrible cost for those enslaved women. The doctors were also responsible for monitoring the women's diets and treating any illnesses that could affect their ability to conceive. But let's be clear, this care wasn't out of genuine concern for their well-being. It was all about making sure there were more enslaved people to boost the plantation owners' profit. It's a dark part of history that we must remember and learn from. Inadequate care and high infant mortality. Enslaved women on sex farms were often given inadequate nutrition and health care, leading to high rates of infant mortality, while fertile women were considered valuable and used as reproductive machines to produce more slaves on sex farms. It's heartbreaking to think about how valuable they were considered just for reproduction, like they were machines. The living conditions were just as terrible, and these women had to work long hours in the fields, leaving them with no time to care for their babies. The infants suffered from malnutrition and illness, and their moms had no access to medical help. One horrifying example was the Angola prison in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where enslaved women were subjected to brutal treatment, little food and water, and denied medical care. The conditions were so filthy that giving birth there led to a staggering 75% infant mortality rate, and sadly this wasn't just isolated to Angola prison. Many other sex farms faced similar high rates of infant deaths. Those poor women endured unimaginable cruelty, and it's just disturbing to think about the pain they went through both for themselves and their children. The persistence of slave breeding after abolition. Even after slavery was abolished, that awful practice of slave breeding and sex farms didn't just disappear. Here it's shocking, right? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution may have put an end to slavery in 1865, but it didn't do anything to stop the despicable act of slave breeding or the sexual exploitation of former slaves. There's evidence suggesting that in some parts of the United States, like in the South, this gruesome practice continued well into the early 20th century, and it's deeply saddening to think that many former slaves still worked on the same plantation where they were once enslaved, enduring the same exploitative and abusive conditions. One infamous case took place in Naz, Mississippi between the late 1860s and the early 1900s, where wealthy white plantation owners engaged in a disturbing system called fancy trade. They bought and sold young light-skinned African-American women who were specially bred for their looks and sexual appeal. These poor women, known as fancy girls, were often the daughters of mixed-race slaves and were sold at auctions for absurdly high prices. Then they were forced into sexual relationships with white plantation owners and their male guests, and their own children were tragically sold back into the slave trade. It's absolutely sickening. On top of all that, there were reports of forced sexual relationships between white plantation owners and their former female slaves. This was made easier by the fact that many former slaves continued to live and work on the same plantations where they were enslaved, still facing the same abuse of treatment. It's just heartbreaking to think about how these terrible practices persisted even after slavery was officially abolished. Justifications and defense of slave breeding and breeding farms were like totally defended by slave owners and supporters of slavery. It's crazy, right? I mean, despite how absolutely horrific and exploitative it was, they actually justified it as necessary for the economic prosperity of the American South. They were all like, oh, we need these enslaved people to breed so we can have more labor for our plantations. Can you believe that even this guy named Hinton Rowan Helper wrote this book in 1857 saying how breeding slaves was like this super important economic strategy? And then there was this U.S. Senator named James Henry Hammond from South Carolina who was like, yeah, we got to keep breeding slaves because it's cheaper than buying new ones from Africa or other places. It's just mind blowing how they completely ignored the humanity of these enslaved people, treating them like near property or commodities. It's so messed up, and even today you still feel the impact of that dehumanization and exploitation in American society. We got to remember and acknowledge these atrocities, learn from history, and work to create a more just and equitable society for everyone. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel History Bazaar for more captivating tales from history.